Hi, my name is Rick Bloodworth, and you're watching the Common Sense Christian channel, or you're listening to the Common Sense Christian channel on podcast. Either way, today we're going to be talking about Christian finances. Now, finances are a very personal thing, aren't they? A lot of times we get very disappointed when anybody talks to us about money or suggests that we use our money in a certain way. And so what I really would like to do is focus upon some of the things that God has indicated for us that we need to be thinking about as far as our finances, and then talk about certain strategies that we might be able to use that will help us to deal with our finances in the best possible ways we can, all the time keeping in mind that we are stewards of God, and that includes stewards of the possessions that He gives us. As far as my background, before I became a preacher, I was a real estate appraiser for 13 years. I really enjoyed that. Had a business degree to begin with, went back later on and got a master's degree in finance and economics. And so a lot of my perspective is going to come from that particular background. For the last 28 years, until this last October, when I retired, I was a preacher for a small congregation at Church of Christ in Happy, Texas. And that gave me some more insight as far as finances, specifically how to make do on not much. Anybody that has struggled with a budget or has struggled with a salary that they feel is smaller than they would like it to be will understand a lot of the things that I'll be talking about today, because I'll certainly be coming from a perspective primarily of always trying to make ends meet. And so while we have that obligation to do that, we want to make sure that we're looking at it as far as, am I serving God the best I can with the resources that I have? And so one of the things that may be helpful to you is to see some of the struggles that Carolyn, my wife, and I went through from the time we were first married, and some of the successes that we had as well. There was a little bit of success along the way, and more than our fair share of failures. Kind of the University of Hard Knocks that we all go through. But some of these experiences may be similar to some of your experiences, and some of them you may not have gone through yet, but they might be helpful as far as navigating the financial straits that we go through in life. So when we first got married, we were on a limited budget. It was more money than we'd ever made in our lives. I think I was making $15,000 a year to begin with as a real estate appraiser. And so that seemed like a lot of money. We started in June of 1982, and by June of 1983, we found out that we weren't handling our finances very well. As a matter of fact, in 1983, we found out that we hadn't been paying nearly enough in taxes, and so the IRS invited us to pay a little bit more. And then in addition to that, a fine on top of that for not paying what we thought we owed. And so we had to start out with that loan to just pay off our tax bill. It wasn't a big loan, but at the time it seemed pretty significant to us. What it did more than anything was give us a reality check. We had to be more responsible with the money we had coming in. For the longest time, we just had it coming in and we spent it as fast as we got it. We were living paycheck to paycheck. And so we decided we had to get some sort of a budget. And so we sat down and very seriously figured out all of our expenses that were fixed, our rent. And while utilities aren't fixed, they're usually going to be a similar amount from month to month. Our gas bill for our automobile was a fixed expense. And so we got all of our fixed expenses together, and we set aside a budget. Before we had even got married, Carolyn and I had decided that there was a certain percentage of our income that we were going to want to give as a contribution to God first before we spent anything else. In the Old Testament, they gave tithes. That was 10%. And the law of Moses was very specific on the offerings they were to bring and how they were to bring them. But in the New Testament, it's a little bit more, maybe a little less specified as far as percentage. But the way that we give is very much given in the New Testament. We're to give generously, we're to give purposefully, we're to give in keeping with our income. And so what somebody else is giving makes no difference to us. We're to do it in keeping with our income. And we're to give on the first day of every week. And so when we read the New Testament commandments, we see that we still have obligations in our giving, and those things have to be given serious consideration. And so that was part of our budget as well, was the percentage that we had predetermined that we would give out of our income. And so we made that budget, and we lived pretty faithfully on that budget, but still had our shares of ups and downs. I want to look at a scripture that might help you. It's found in Proverbs 27:23, and it says this: "Know well the condition of your flocks, and give attention to your herds, for riches do not last forever." Now we understand the third part, riches don't last forever, but what do flocks and herds have to do with us? And what I want to maybe make the bridge on, the comparison to, is the type of life that they were living when this verse was written 3,000 years ago. This is a proverb by King Solomon. It's inspired by God, so it contains a truth that's worthy of us investigating. So he started off by saying, "Know well the condition of your flocks." 3,000 years ago, they were very much an agricultural-based society. And most people had some kind of animals that they were raising. And in Israel, that meant sheep and goats. Those sheep and goats were very important to them. They were first and foremost food for them. And so they had to have part of their flock for that. They were able to gather the wool from the sheep, and they were able to make clothing from that. And so the wool from the sheep was very important. They would have other needs, and so they might be raising gardens or crops or vineyards or whatever it was they had. But for the needs that they did not have the ability to take care of, they could sell part of their herd or part of their flock, and they could exchange then the money they got for that for the needs and the desires that they had that were right for them to have. They also bartered with their livestock, and so you can see how important livestock was to them and how important it was for them to know the condition of their herds. It was even a savings account for them when you think about it, because if their herd was large enough, they could save back a portion of that herd each year and use it specifically for breeding purposes and continue to grow that flock or that herd to where it actually became a sort of a savings account. But before they did anything else, according to the law of Moses they were under, they had to give the first of their flock, the firstborn male from their flock had to be sacrificed to God. They were to give 1/10 of their possessions to God. And so before they did anything else, they gave the first and they gave the best to God. The rest of it, they could do anything they wanted to do as long as it wasn't sinful. And so let me encourage you that as you start thinking about a budget, I would seriously consider about an amount or a percentage that you feel like would be acceptable to God as far as your giving goes. Take that right off the top before you spend money on anything else. And I believe you're going to find that your life's going to be blessed. We've done this, my wife and I, for over 40 years of our marriage, and we've never been let down by God. He's always taken care of us. There have been times where we weren't as certain that things were going to work out, but they always have. And I'm convinced they always will. And the reason for that is this. When I was a young man in high school and college, I worked for Kentucky Fried Chicken, 5 years as a cook. I don't remember ever worrying about running out of chicken to cook because my bosses hired me to cook, and so my bosses were going to make sure I had the chicken to cook, not to mention the shortening to cook it in and the flour and all the other ingredients that we needed to make the chicken. My point is that as an employee of Kentucky Fried Chicken, my job was just to do my job. I didn't have to worry about the resources. Well, when you think about this life, God has set us here to serve Him. One of the beautiful parts of what God has done is He allows us to serve Him in all sorts of capacities. You get to choose your job. You get to choose who you'll marry. You'll get to choose what kind of hobbies you have and what kind of recreation that you'll do. As long as they're not sinful, as long as they're in accord with His standards, there's so much freedom in what we can do, where we can live. And so we're very blessed in that. But God expects us to give Him from our sources first, because He is the source of all of our income. And so as long as we keep that in mind, I think not only are we going to do pretty good, or as good as we can with our finances for any given situation, but we're also going to find out that this life is pretty enjoyable. The blessings that God gives to us are amazing when you think about that. Well, now let's start talking about some very basics. When I was probably here for just a year or two after we'd moved to Happy, I started coaching basketball teams. I'd done that in Casper, Wyoming, where we had lived before, and had coached, I think, about 4 boys basketball teams, 5th grade boys basketball teams. And when we moved here, they asked if I wanted to coach, and I said sure. And so I started coaching little boys, 3rd grade and 4th grade. And then I found out that as my daughters grew older, that I would just soon coach girls, and I started coaching girls. And so over the years, I've probably coached dozens of teams and hundreds of kids. We all started out with the same thing, though. Before they got into a basketball game, we would learn the basics. We'd start with the pivot foot and planting your pivot foot if you're familiar with basketball. If not, you'll just understand the basic part. But they'd plant their pivot foot. They'd learn how to dribble. They'd learn how to pass, and they'd learn how to pass under control with thought behind that pass. They'd learn how to shoot. They'd learn how to defend. And so these very basic things, from pivot foot to dribbling to shooting and passing to defending, they had to learn that before they could play the basketball game. But once they had those basics down, their fundamentals, then they could find that they would do pretty good, and they could build off those fundamentals and become a pretty good basketball player. And for those that enjoyed the sport, it made the sport all that much more enjoyable. Well, finances are the same way. You have to have a foundation, and you have to start with the basics. And so let me give you some suggestions as far as what you might want to consider doing, some of the things that we have done. And I'll start back a little bit with our circumstances. When my wife and I were first married, we started out on a draw. I went to work as a real estate appraiser for my dad, and he trained me. He was a very honorable man, a man with integrity, had a lot of respect among the banking community and the real estate community that we dealt with in real estate appraisals. So I had a really good start there and a good foundation to start with. But we still struggled. I started during the oil bust of 1982 in Casper, Wyoming, and that oil bust lasted a lot of years. And so there were some lean years in my appraising. As a matter of fact, it took about 10 years to pay back all the draws that I had for money that hadn't been earned yet, and then to pay off all of our bills that we had accumulated. There came a point at one time, because I didn't handle our finances as well as I should, and because of the financial circumstances we found ourselves in, as far as the oil bust, that we got into trouble. As a matter of fact, there was a point where we had a mortgage on our house, and we had a second mortgage on our house. We had bought a new car with a new car payment and had to get extra insurance for that new car. You can't just get liability, and so it was more expensive. We had maxed out all of our credit cards, and there was a point. We had our house on the market trying to sell it, but we had more in mortgages on the house than the house was worth and it could be sold for. And so we literally were in a situation where if business didn't pick up, or if that house didn't sell, we were going to have to be looking at bankruptcy. Now, if any of you have had to do that before, you know what a trying time something like that can be. Now, fortunately, we didn't have to go through that. God blessed us and with a huge amount of business, to the point where we were able to not only pay off some of the bills that we had, but we were able to pay off even a loan that my parents had made to me years earlier. and we were able to get out from underneath that. And then so for the next 3 years, we made so much money that we always had an excess. We bought one of the nicest houses in one of the nicest neighborhoods, bought another new car, leased another new car. The only bills that we had were that car lease and our mortgage, and we were paying our mortgage down early. And so there were several years where it's kind of like the Old Testament, between the 7 lean years and the 7 fat years. Well, we were in our 7 fat years, and so we were doing well. But all this time, we had to deal with our finances and whatever circumstance we found ourselves in. And it was some of the experiences that we went through during that time that have really helped me to realize that there are certain strategies that we can do with our finances to take a lot of the stress out of life. This life has a lot of trials, it has a lot of tests, there's a lot of stress that goes with it. Your job, your family, your relationships, your health, all these things will go into it. If you can keep from adding the additional stress of unnecessary financial burdens, you're going to do pretty well. I started listening to a man by the name of what is his name? Dave Ramsey. Sorry about that. I had a senior moment. It was a book called Financial Peace. And I started reading that book and started getting certain strategies of handling my finances a little bit better. When we had a little bit of extra money to invest, I got a couple of other books, and they were books. Some of them were books of fiction. One of them was called The Wealthy Barber by David Chilton. And there was another one called The Richest Man in Babylon by George Clason. And they just kind of talked about finances in a fictional setting to where it was interesting to read about them, but they had principles embedded within the stories that they told that really very helpful to us to understand. And so by starting to look at different authors and different methods and different strategies, we learned to do things with our finances that eventually became fairly successful. It took us about 40 years to get to that point, and we're still not at that point. We're not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but God has certainly blessed us. And so let me tell you some of the basics, some of the fundamentals that perhaps will help you. The first thing we did was we set a budget. A lot of people don't even like to think about setting a budget, but a budget isn't as restrictive as you might think it is. As a matter of fact, while you might look at a budget as being restrictive, and there are going to be certain restrictions that are in it, there are restrictions that you've placed within there. And the restrictions of a budget, I believe you're going to find, are far more light than the bondage that you'll have from too much debt. And so make you a budget. Make sure that whatever you're going to give to God, whatever percentage that you've determined or you and your spouse have determined, is set aside first. And make sure it's in keeping with your income. I know that you might feel guilty if you're not incredibly generous with God. And we do want to be generous, but not so much so that it puts you on the street with a sign that says, we'll work for food. Be reasonable with this, but also be generous. And so you have your contribution, and then get all of your fixed expenses wherever you are. If you're starting out, let me encourage you to avoid any unnecessary debt that you can. And by that, I mean, I'm not sure I would ever go out and buy another vehicle. Carolyn and I have owned dozens of vehicles, I suppose, maybe not dozens, but over a dozen vehicles, and only 2 of them were new. One of them was I guess 3 of them were new. One of them was a lease when we first got married that turned into a purchase. Another one we purchased, and it nearly put us into bankruptcy or added to our financial woes that did that. And then another was another lease that was just for 2 years. It was always easier from my perspective looking back just to get a good used vehicle. Did we have more repairs? Of course we did. But we had so much fewer expenses that we weren't financially burdened by those repairs. And so if you're just starting out, I would be really, really careful about what types of debt you took on. If you haven't gotten a lot of student loan debt yet and you're thinking about going to college, Let me recommend that you try and do that without student loan debt, at least as much as you can, because there's nothing worse than just getting out of college, not having a job yet, or even getting your first job and finding out that $300, $400, or $500 of that are already spoken for because of the student loans that you've racked up. And so I'd be very careful with student loans. I'd be very cautious about buying a new home right after I first got married. Renting something at first might make a whole lot more sense for you. You have far fewer obligations. You don't have as many surprises when you rent. Do you still have to come up with rent money? Of course you do. Does it feel like sometimes you're just throwing it away month by month because you're not building up equity in a house that you own? And of course, that's true. We own our house now, but there have been times where renting made a whole lot more financial sense to us. And so whatever it is you do, be very careful on your debt. I wouldn't go out and have a nice steak dinner with your wife or your husband and put it on a credit card and then pay for that steak dinner for the next 3 years at 24% interest as you pay it off, along with all the other steak dinners and different things that you've accumulated. Watch what you're spending your money on. And just if you have a budget, your budget will be predetermined by yourself and your spouse if you're married, as far as how you're going to be spending your money. So it's really not as restrictive as you might think, and it will give you something some parameters that will help you get through this life that we're living right now. So after having done that, let's say that you're in a position where you already have debt and you're trying to figure out how to get out of debt. If it's still manageable, here is a strategy that you might want to think about. If you have at the end of your budget extra money, in other words, this amount of money, maybe you make $3,000 a month and you've got $2,700 a month that's spoken for through all of your budgeting items. You still have $300 left over. Well, what I would start doing is I would start separating that money into different accounts. One of them I would just have as a cash savings account, and just a third of what you're making. Another third I would stick into some type of investment. My wife and I started investing in physical silver right after I first got married, and that has proven to be a good savings account for us. There's a lot of fluctuations in that, and sometimes people want to invest in precious metals like they'd invest in a lottery ticket, and I don't suggest you do it that way, but it has held its value. Somebody one time put it this way: in the late 50s and 60s, you could buy a gallon of gas for 2 silver dimes. Today, you could take those 2 same silver dimes and sell them for about $3.50 or $4 for the 2 dimes, and you could still buy a gallon of gas. And so it's held its value, much more so than just sticking some money in a mattress or even putting it into a savings account where your savings are going to be taxed and eaten up with things that perhaps you didn't want them to be eaten up with. The other third, so you've got a third into cash savings, a third into some kind of investment, mutual fund, whatever, real estate, whatever it is you're thinking about. And then the other third, put into paying down whatever debt you have. And I would start with my credit cards first if I had credit card debt. I would then go to any car loans that I had and pay those down as quickly as possible. I would then go to student loans and pay that down. And then if I had a mortgage, I would pay that down last. But as far as that goes, if you can figure out something to do with your excess money that's not just, well, let's go out and celebrate, I think you'll enjoy that. Do you need some celebration? Of course you do. Do you need some recreation? Of course you do. Stick that in your budget. Make it a reasonable amount, and then kind of stick to that amount. I think you'll be very pleased if you do that. And then here's some Dave Ramsey advice that I think is very important. Before you start doing that idea of maybe a third, and a third, or whatever it is you decide to do with excess money, the first thing to do is to get some kind of a reserve account, an emergency account. He used to recommend $1,000. He may recommend more than that right now, and just realistically, I think I would double that if I was going to put an emergency account together. And that way, if you're going to have life happen, large medical bills or a repair bill or a hot water heater will go out, something is going to happen. It wasn't planned, but you know that these things happen because that's how life is. And so if you have a little something set aside for those emergencies, and then you spend it unbegrudgingly when it happens, you don't have to whine when it happens. I've got the money set aside for it. I think you'll find that life's a whole lot more comfortable. Maybe even before I would fully fund an emergency account, I would fully stock a pantry. We live in times where inflation is going so rapidly that the food that you buy today and the staples you buy today are going to be more next month than they are right now. And so I always recommend to people with the first $1,000 or $2,000 they have is to stock a pantry. I'm not talking about going and buying a bunch of canned goods that you're probably never going to use, that you're just going to throw away 10 years from now when you find they've expired. I'm talking about buying things you know you're going to use. Just go around your house and see what those items are. You can go out to your garage. You can see that you're going to need oil and oil filters for your car if you change your own oil, antifreeze and different things like that. And then go into the bathroom and you can see that toothbrushes and toothpaste and deodorant and shampoo and soap and razors and toilet paper and on are going to be things that you know you're going to be using, and you know that they're not going to expire, or at least they're not going to go bad very quickly. And so stock up on that. In your kitchen, there's going to be things like paper towels and napkins and plastic bags and trash sacks and all sorts of things that don't go bad that you know you're going to use, spices for your food. And I would even get some reserve food in mind, whether it's canned goods that you typically use to begin with. Dave Ramsey's beans and rice are always a wonderful staple to have on hand. You can buy a 25-pound bag of beans and a 25-pound bag of rice. They'll last forever if you store them right. And then you'll have them on hand if you need them. And so you start building your pantry. And what this allows you to do is maybe as time goes by, to be able to just buy things when they're on sale. If you run out of something, you can just go to your pantry and replenish it. And if it's not on sale right then, you can wait a little bit. But the reason that this works so nicely is, again, you're going to have things happen in life. People lose jobs. They get sick. There have been worldwide depressions and national recessions. Just about anything can happen. And so just be prudent on this. I'm not suggesting that you tear down your barns, build newer ones so you can store enough to have it made for the rest of your life. I'm just saying take some thought into being a good steward of the possessions that God's given to you. And so as you go through that, get your cash reserve, get your pantry in place, and then any excess you have, start dividing up a little bit, putting it in different places, and I think that you'll find that will be a pretty good strategy. Anyway, that's probably enough for today. I'd like to take at least one episode every week or so to talk about finances and just the things that we go through. If you have some specific questions, just put them in the comments if you're on YouTube, and I'll be glad to answer whatever I can, perhaps in a future video or podcast. But let me leave you with this. Again, going back to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Why do you worry about what you'll eat or drink or what you'll wear? The pagans run after these things, and your Father in heaven knows that you need them." And then in Matthew 6:33, he says this, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well." When I worked at Kentucky Fried Chicken, I didn't have to worry if my bosses were going to give me the resources to do the job that they had hired me to do. As servants of God, we do not have to worry about God making sure that we have the resources we need to serve him the best way we can. Sometimes this life is a test, and our service will be tested. Just do the best you can with whatever situation you have. And remember, God will take care of you. Jesus said, "The birds of the air don't worry because the Father feeds them." but he also had an implication in that, or an unspoken implication that's really good for us to understand. God doesn't throw the worms into the nests of the birds. They have to get up early and go seek them out. What he gives them is opportunity to be well fed. He gives us the same opportunity. So you be a good steward. Be willing to do the work that you're called to do. Always remember that you're here for him, and remember that you're an eternal being. This physical life's going to be over someday. The one with the most, who dies with the most toys, doesn't win. It's the one who humbly serves God as best as he can with the resources he's been given, that by God's grace and by Christ's shed blood will be with them for all eternity. This is the bottom line. Hopefully some of these suggestions will help you. They're just suggestions. If you've got things that you do that you might think will be helpful to others, again, put them in the comments below, and we'll try and traverse this life together and maybe help a few people out along the way. Appreciate your listening and tuning in today. I pray that God will richly bless you.